Hello, you're watching the Train Signal course Windows PowerShell 3 Essentials. This is the lesson entitled The PowerShell Paradigm. I'm your instructor, Jeff Hicks. In this lesson, I want to talk about and demonstrate the PowerShell paradigm because this is a little bit different than what you may be used to in terms of managing your systems with scripting or any sort of management tools. So I want to start off by giving you a brief history of PowerShell and talk about how we got where we are today. Way back in the days of NT4, we had, from Microsoft, we had the management console, the MMC, that we're used to now. It was really first introduced in the days of NT4. And we had resource kit tools that we could use to manage our systems. So some things were GUI, some things were graphical, a little bit of everything that you had to learn. As time went on, we got to Windows XP and Windows 2000, and there were still more resource kit tools. This was the time when VB scripts started becoming really important to IT pros, and so people would learn how to create VB scripts to get system information with WMI or configure things. And that was kind of the management tools, other than, again, the usual management consoles. But we're always looking for other better ways to be efficient and to manage our environment. Well, eventually we get to 2006 and PowerShell version 1 is introduced. This gave us opportunities to manage systems in a way that we couldn't really do before. A lot of basic functionality, a lot of things that we take for granted now weren't there in version 1, but 2006 gives us PowerShell. VB script is still around, but hopefully people are starting to transition. Some people are starting to see, hey, this PowerShell thing, this could be something. We should be using this. PowerShell version 2 was introduced in 2009. This gave us PowerShell remoting, really fixed obviously whatever bugs you generally have in a 1.0 release, and added some new functionality. Version 2 was available on XP and later, and really kind of got a lot more people interested in PowerShell. And then finally, towards the end of 2012, with the release of Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012, we were introduced to PowerShell 3.0, which built on top of everything that had come before. And by this point, Microsoft is saying, this is the management tool that you need to be learning how to use, because we're going to be building our management tools and our platforms on top of PowerShell. So the more that you understand PowerShell, the more that you can get ahead and more you'll be able to manage your environment. And in 2012, we start moving towards this cloud-based data center and more distributed systems. And so the remoting features and being able to touch 100 computers at once, PowerShell is really great at that. So that's kind of where we got from where we were back in the days of NT4 all the way up to today. So we started off with tools. You have to learn a lot of different tools to do different things. And now we have PowerShell, which is really, the intent is it's one tool. So once you learn PowerShell, you should be able to manage everything in your Windows environment. But there's a paradigm shift here that I guess I want to make sure you understand. Enterprise efficiency and automation doesn't really scale well with a GUI. If I need to create 100 new user accounts, using Active Directory users and computers it'll do the job, but it's going to be really cumbersome. Or if I need to find the 10 latest event logs in the system that are error on 1,000 different computers, GUIs aren't really going to cut that. Now, third-party vendor may have built a GUI that has an agent and all sorts of bells and whistles so that, yeah, you can get that information. But really, GUIs don't scale well. Microsoft knows from the days of Big Iron and Unix that IT pros need a command line environment in order to really scale well. So what you'll find with PowerShell, if you can do something with one machine, you can probably do it with 10, 100, or 1,000. So command line tools and other scripting languages, even things like VB script, tend to be text-based, which at the time are kind of okay, and a lot of the Unix tools are, obviously Unix being Unix and Linux are text-based operating systems, so that their tools tend to be more text-based. People are very proficient at that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But for Windows is more of an object object-oriented operating system, so we need tools to manage that accordingly. So PowerShell is an object-oriented or object-centered management engine that's based on the .NET framework. Everything that we deal with in PowerShell is an object. We're no longer going to have to deal with parsing text. Now this management engine, well, we'll talk more about that, and you'll see that it means a number of things. So it's that instead of parsing text, we work through this engine with commands called commandlets and work with objects in a pipeline. We're not going to be necessarily scripting, we're going to be running commands. But we could do scripting if we wanted to, and you'll see this throughout the course. This management engine that I'm talking about is hosted in an application. Now, for most people, what their experience with PowerShell, they're going to think of PowerShell as the blue screen they see when they click the PowerShell icon. And what it's really doing is running the PowerShell.exe application that's being hosted in the legacy CMD window. It's still a CMD window, so it has all the limitations of the old CMD window we've had since the days of NT4. So a lot of people, when they first see PowerShell, they see that and they go, oh, well, it's just in a CMD window. This is an awful tool. Well, that's not necessarily the case. This version of PowerShell.exe that we'll be working with just happens to run in the legacy window, for good or for bad, but it's something that everyone has. There's nothing preventing other people from building other applications to host this PowerShell engine. In fact, Microsoft has a second PowerShell application, the PowerShell ISE, which is a graphical PowerShell application. You can run tools, you can build scripts in it. It's still hosting this PowerShell engine. So all the commands I'm going to show you and you're going to learn and the concepts kind of still apply to this, to wherever you're running PowerShell. In fact, you will find there are a number of third parties that can host PowerShell. There's a whole PowerShell community of developers that anyone could really create an application that is running PowerShell. For example, you might be familiar with PowerGUI from Quest Software, now part of Dell, or Sapien has their PowerShell Studio and PrimalScript. Those can host PowerShell, as well as PowerShell Plus from Idera. Just a sampling of applications that are hosting PowerShell. Yes, some of these may be used more for other things, like the Sapien ones. You're probably going to use that to develop scripts. Maybe Idera, you might be developing scripts, or PowerGUI, you just might be using that to manage your environment, but you'll be using PowerShell, but it's in a graphical environment. So don't think that just when you see that blue PowerShell window that's PowerShell. PowerShell is the engine behind the application. We'll just happen to be using that CMD window. To be clear here, when PowerShell first came out, a lot of people thought that, oh, it's just another scripting language like VBScript. Well, it's not. I can certainly do scripting in PowerShell, but it's not just a scripting language. It's also just not, a new version of the command console, which is what I just talked about. And it's certainly not a passing fad. A lot of people think, oh yeah, PowerShell is just the latest thing for Microsoft, and we wait another year and they're going to give us something else. Microsoft has committed to PowerShell as being the management standard that all other applications and platforms are being built and will be managed upon. So PowerShell is the tool that you're going to need to learn. So it's not just a scripting language, it's not just a management console, and it is here to stay. In fact, why don't we go into PowerShell and let me walk through give you a demonstration. Perhaps you've really not seen PowerShell in action, so I'm going to give you some ideas of what PowerShell looks like and how this paradigm works and why I think you're going to find this an exciting feature. So let's jump into my Windows 8 box and open up PowerShell. Okay, so I'm in my Windows 8 desktop. I've opened up a PowerShell session. A lot of things I'm going to show you here we're going to cover in more detail throughout the course. I just want to give you an understanding and appreciation of this PowerShell paradigm that I'm talking about. I certainly don't expect you to understand everything I'm going to show you, especially if you are new to PowerShell. So don't worry too much about trying to understand what the commands are doing. Think more about the results and the paradigm of how I'm working and what I get for what I have to type. We'll see here what I'm talking about. And all these demos will be available as part of the downloaded lesson material you should be able to get for each lesson. So first off, let me run a command here called get command, and the command type is commandlet. A commandlet is the core unit of functionality in PowerShell. This is the command. Get command is actually the name of a commandlet that does just what it says. It's going to get all the commands. And these are all the things that I have right now on my Windows 8 box. Now this Windows 8 box happens to have RSAT, or Remote Server Administration tools, installed, so I have additional tools than what you might see. But these are all the commands that are available to me. Now because this is a command line experience, I did pipe this to more, so it didn't scroll all the way off the screen. When you see this with more, you can either hit the Enter key, which will go down one line at a time. Spacebar will advance one screen at a time, or you can just hit Q to break out of that. So those are all of the commands that are available. It's very easy in PowerShell to discover what I can do, what commands can I do, what are the objects, and we'll cover, again, a lot of this throughout the course. Let's get another set of commands. Let's find all the commands that have the verb export. And you can see there I've got commands like aliases, functions, commandlets, but they all have the same verb export. One of the nice things about PowerShell is this consistency where verbs follow a standard name-singular noun naming convention, and the verbs are all from a standard set of .NET verbs like get, set, remove, export, convert. So it makes it very easy to understand what it is you are looking for. In fact, I can also have PowerShell say, hey, show me all of the commands that start with the noun ACL. All right, so I can get ACL and set ACL. And I bet even without looking at those commands, you probably have a good idea about what it is those commands are going to do. All right, so let's look at one of these commandlets in action. Again, I'm not doing any scripting here. I'm just running commands interactively on my Windows 8 desktop, running PowerShell version 3. Again, you can run PowerShell version 3 on Windows 7 or Windows 2008 as well. So I'm going to run the get service commandlet. I bet you can guess what that commandlet's going to do. And there's the result. And as you can see, I see all of these services. Let's scroll back up here. I can see the status. Here's the service name, and here's the display name. Now, that looks like text, but it's not. Well, it is, because at the end of the PowerShell pipeline, PowerShell has to display text because we're not machines. We can't read or see the object. But really, that's the text representation of a service object, which PowerShell worked with behind the scenes. So if I wanted to say, just find me all of these services that have a name property that starts with the letter B that are running, well, I don't have to do any sort of text parsing. All I have to do is work with the object in order to achieve that. In fact, to show you here, let's run get service. I'm going to pipe this to another commandlet called get member. Now, piping is a key concept of PowerShell. I can get a group of objects and then hand them off to another commandlet to do something, and they can hand them off to another commandlet. In this case, get member is just going to look at the object and tell me everything it knows about that. So I can see what type of object it is. I can see its methods, its properties. So even though that the display only showed me 3 columns, you can see that there are multiple properties there. So this is a great way, again, it's not complicated necessarily, for me to discover how to work with PowerShell and to work with these objects. So let's take this information, for example, this concept of working with objects in a pipeline. Again, to show you how easy this is with no text parsing. Let's go ahead and get all the services that start with the letter S, and I'm going to pipe them to the where object commandlet, where the status property is equal to running. Again, don't worry so much about the syntax. We'll be covering all of this. And then I'm going to sort on the display name of those service objects, and then I'm just going to select the display name. So there we go. A one-line command, no scripting, that got me all of the services that are running, starting with the letter S. sorted on the display name, and then just displaying the display name. Maybe not the most compelling example, but conceptually, I hope you see that there's some really powerful things happening there. I did not have to do any sort of scripting. I did not have to go and find and read some arcane 1,000-page book to try to figure out how to do this. A lot of this information is available in PowerShell's help system, which we'll also cover. I got service objects, I filtered them, I sorted, I selected, I got my result. That's kind of really the PowerShell paradigm. Now, if this was, say, this was a command that I wanted to run repeatedly, all I would have to do is take that same, just copy and paste that get service all the way up to select display name, paste that into a text file with a PS1 file extension, and I have a PowerShell script. And there are a few other things we'd have to work out in order to run that script, which we'll cover later, but that's all the script is. It's the same commands that you would run interactively in the console. Because there's a lot of typing in the console, we also have this thing called aliases. For example, I've got the command, which if you use a CMD prompt, the dir command. You know, if I'm going to do directory of the work folder, it gives me a listing. Obviously, the output is different than the dir command you would see in a regular CMD, but you can tell that that is file and directory. So here's some directories. I can see when it was last modified. The length is the size and the file name. So that directory command, well, is it really a directory command? Look at this. Let's say you come from the Linux world where the command is ls. Same type of thing works. What we have here is this concept of aliases. An alias is just a shortcut to a PowerShell command. In fact, I can run a command called getAlias and say, hey, what is dir an alias for? And it's actually an alias for getChildItem. You know, well, the PowerShell team didn't want you to have to learn a whole new language just to do basic things like a directory listing. They won't have to try to find getChildItem. If you're coming from the Linux world, you're familiar with the ls command, or the Microsoft world, you're probably familiar with the dir command. So just create substitutes. Now, when you run dir, you're not running the actual dir command, and ls is not the actual ls command. You're really running getChildItem. So for very simple things, that's not too difficult. But if I wanted to learn how to use this, well, this is, again, a great thing about the PowerShell paradigm. I just have to ask for help. Help dir, or help ls, or help getChildItem. You can see I get help for getChildItem. I see the syntax, the description. This syntax has a set of parameters that control how this command works. So if I wanted to recursively search in the CMD world, it would be dir/s. Well, we don't have that here. You can see in reading that, I would use dir-recurse. So if I wanted to then, I could do directory C work, all my PS1 files. I want to get just the files. I'm going to skip the folders. And I want to recursively search, hit enter, and there are my results. I could then do other things with those objects. I could sort them further, I could filter, I could measure how much disk space they're taking, I could convert the information to CSV, I could send it off to a text file. Many things that I could do. But having that help built in is tremendously beneficial, and we'll cover the help system in a future lesson. But because of that, let me give you an example. So I'm going to get those same files again. I'm going to use a variation on the where object syntax. So I'm going to get just those objects that have an extension. I'm going to group them by the extension, because sometimes objects will change. So when I group them, I'm going to end up with a different type of object, which has a name count, and I'm going to create a custom property that is going to basically show me how many objects there are for each particular type, and then sort on that size in descending order, and then we're going to make it all a nice pretty table. Again, don't worry too much about trying to understand the specifics about what that command is doing. Just know that there's the result. So there's a one-line command. Yes, it might be a little complicated at first, but hopefully, you know, when you get through this course, and then you come back to this lesson, come back and look at this example and see if that makes more sense. You go, oh yes, now I understand what he's doing. And yeah, that really is cool and it is really easy. So I was able to, with no scripting, get a list of all of the files in my work folder by extension, by file type. So I can see how many there are and how much disk space they are using. That's kind of the great thing about the PowerShell. I don't have to do any parsing. I just work with the objects that were going through the pipeline. Now, one of the things that you'll find useful in working with PowerShell, and I'll use this a lot, are variables. So I'm going to create a variable called $computers. Variable names in PowerShell always start with a $sign. And I'm going to give it 3 computer names. So these are computers that are running in the Chicago office in GlobalMatics. This saves me from having to retype things. So now I'm going to run another command called getSimInstance, which will retrieve WMI information from those computers. I'm going to get the Win32 operating system class from those 3 computers. I didn't get anything written to the screen because PowerShell wrote that to the variable $OS. And I can then take that variable and pipe that again to another command called selectObject. That's an alias of select. Grab some properties, create a custom property, calculating the uptime. Grab the computer name so I can see which information goes with which computer. And there we go. Again, objects in the pipeline. I can manipulate them, format them, order, sort, restructure, add properties. Because there is no uptime property for that object, I created it. But I can now use that information in something else. I could have then exported this to a CSV file, or save this to a text file, or sent it as a mail message. Lots of really amazing things that you can do with PowerShell. Once you understand that PowerShell paradigm and that you're working with objects in the pipeline. I encourage you to find some time to run help star 3.0, which is kind of a shortcut way of getting to the help topic. They'll tell you everything, well, not everything, but it kind of hits the highlights about why you should be interested in PowerShell version 3. Certainly these are a lot of things that we're going to be covering as well, but you may want to see them and understand or kind of read that information as well. I'd like you to get in the habit of running through the help topics, especially as I bring up new commands in other lessons. Take time to read the help. And again, we're going to cover help in more detail in an upcoming lesson. All right? So there's a look at the PowerShell paradigm. Let's go back to the slides and kind of wrap up this lesson. So as you've seen, PowerShell is really not that difficult. Now, it may have looked difficult. If you've never seen PowerShell, I'm sure a lot of the commands that I typed looked complicated, but with a little experience and a little time, you'll understand it, you'll grasp the concepts, and you certainly don't have to start out with as complicated commands like I came up with. But really, you have to decide, do I need to learn PowerShell? Is it for me? Well, I got a couple quick questions for you. Do you manage Windows-based servers? If so, you need to be using and learning PowerShell. Do you manage platforms like Exchange or SharePoint or SQL? If you do, you will need to learn PowerShell. Those platforms, Exchange especially, are built on top of PowerShell. Now, PowerShell can have GUIs. That GUI is still, though, sitting on top of that PowerShell engine. And really what you're doing when you're running something through the GUI, such as an Exchange, you're running PowerShell commands. Well, those people who really understand PowerShell can skip the GUI and drop right down to the prompt, run the same commands, plus more, and do things that are impossible to do in the GUI. So if you're going to be managing Windows or anything from Microsoft, PowerShell's got to be on your radar. I like to tell people, do you need to have repeatable or consistent management tools? One of the problems we had in the days of NT4 and the early days of Windows 2000 were there were a lot of tools to manage our systems, but they were all different. So we had to learn lots of different tools, learn different command line tools. The different command line tools had different parameters. Everything was a little bit different. Now we have a single, repeatable, consistent. Once you learn the PowerShell way, it's the PowerShell way. So if I learn how this works now, as I bring in third-party tools, say from VMware or Citrix, their tools, assuming that they have properly followed Microsoft guidelines, and most vendors do, you can learn their tools in much shorter fashion because you've already understood the PowerShell pieces. So having this consistency in the long run really helps you and your organization. It comes down to this, proverbial, do you need to do more with less? If I need to manage 100 servers and I need to do the same thing on all 100 servers, well, you certainly don't want to go through a GUI manually to do all of that. You want to have a consistent, repeatable task that you can run either interactively, or you can take that same command and put it in a PowerShell script and then just run that script and do what you need to do for 100 machines with really not a lot of effort. And finally, I certainly always tell people who come to my conferences and I do training for, if you want a long-lasting IT career, PowerShell has to be in your career plans. People who are not going to learn PowerShell either aren't going to learn it because they don't run Windows environments and none of these things really apply to them. If you're in a Linux and Unix only shop, PowerShell may not necessarily be for you. If you're watching this, I doubt that that's not you. People who want to get ahead in their career, PowerShell is going to be a key differentiator. So you'll want to know and learn PowerShell, which is why I'm glad you're watching this course. I always tell people it's not a matter of if you'll be using PowerShell, really only a matter of when. So the sooner that you can get a grasp on the essentials and fundamentals of how to do your job using PowerShell, the further off you'll be and the better you'll be in your career and your company. All right? So that kind of wraps up this look at the PowerShell paradigm. Again, this course that you'll be looking at is really just all the essentials you'll need to get up and running kind of in an interactive process. I encourage you to try to follow the lessons in numbered order, but you are free to jump around if you like. So, thank you very much for your time, and I'll catch you in the next lesson.